Hello, and thank you very much for coming to see us talk tonight. We're thrilled to be here to talk to you about fashion and art and history, because these are some of our truly favourite things, and we love to talk about it. First, let us introduce ourselves. So my name is Kiara Bulley, and this is my sister, Bianca. And as you may have been able to tell, we are sisters. So it felt very appropriate for our first slide here to be a pairing of the two sisters by Jean-Honor Fragonard from 1769 with this beautiful photo of our work by photographer Selena Vincenzo of sisters Imogen and Britt Clark, who are sitting there reclining in an almost perfect symmetry to this beautiful painting. Tonight, I am going to be doing most of the talking. Bianca is in charge of our slides and has the almighty clicker. And a lot of the talking that I'm going to be doing is reading from a script, because I've got a lot of information that I want to go through with you, and this is the most succinct way of doing it. So bear with me. So first, to kind of talk about us. We call ourselves fashion practitioners, which is an easy way of saying we do a lot of different things centering around fashion. In the scope of our work, this has seen us being fashion and costume designers and makers, illustrators, cutters, art finishers, activists, writers, and educators. Currently, you will find us working in the local costume industry, running our independent fashion brand and collaborating as part of the Stitchery Collective to create fashion-based community events and artworks. We are significantly motivated by the people around us, and a lot of the work that we do is based in building relationships and working with other creatives or creating points of coming together for creative communities. Being a part of a collective, being in a business partnership, being involved in education and our local industry are all significant elements of this that motivate and sustain us creatively. Bianca's passion has always been with costume, and she is presently the assistant head of wardrobe at Opera Queensland. She has designed two of this year's shows at OQ, La Boheme and The Frog Prince, and is diligently waiting for international borders to reopen so that she can complete a program of study in costume tailoring as part of the Churchill Fellowship awarded to her in 2019. So the pandemic really cut that short. My fashion background has seen me primarily teaching and lecturing fashion in university, which is why I'm the one doing all the talking. I've also been working in the film industry, and I'm currently working as the head pattern cutter at Queensland Theatre, which has just opened the world premiere of Boy Swallows Universe this week, which this slide captures a wild green gown that I made. It's right at the center of that image. Now, together we run an independent fashion brand called Bulley Bulley that we established in 2019. This small fashion business was developed around our shared love of dressing up as creative and critical practice, and the idea of bringing some of that transportive elements of costume and dress history into the world of fashion and everyday dress. We frequently describe our brand style as silly, which is probably a bit of an incongruous way of describing what we do. We use the word silly as a catch-all phrase to signify our interest in the fun and playful nature of dress-ups, an act that for most people is locked away in their childhoods. Silliness and frivolity is also how fashion is broadly viewed as a cultural practice. So when we use the term silly to describe our work, it is also aimed as a sardonic retort to this narrow perception of this very vast cultural industry and field of practice, which is fashion. As designers, we want our clothes to be fun, playful, and inclusive. We want to make interesting and technically challenging clothes as makers and designers. This is definitely not the cheapest or fastest way to make clothes. But creative satisfaction is the aim of the game here for us, and making technically challenging clothes is how we sustain our motivation, innovation, and interest in what we do. We try to focus on natural fibres and occasionally do one-offs in found vintage fabrics as well. We also do a lot of hand painting, dyeing, bleaching, and surface design in order to create unique textiles. Working with a strong link between the head, the intellectual creative practice, and the hand, the manual creative practice, is at the core of what we want for the brand. And of course, we are inspired by historic clothing. This comes strongly from our work in costume, as well as with a general fascination with old clothes. We look to the past to see if we can spy a different version of the future. The past is an alien land, mysterious and alluring, that we like to visit and learn from. So what else will we be talking about today? So, the exhibition, 500 Years of European Masterpieces, offers us a very interesting perspective for those of us who have a keen interest in the history of fashion. Just like this collection of paintings, most fashion theorists argue that the beginning of the contemporary Western fashion system began around 500 or 600 years ago, during the medieval period. So in this exhibition, we not only have a compelling timeline of painting in Europe over the last 5 centuries, we also have a history of dress and dress culture being articulated for us. For our talk with you today, we are going to walk you through these centuries using some of the exhibition's masterpieces to illustrate the fashions of their time. We will also be discussing some 20th century fashion designers who look towards the past for inspiration. And we will be taking you through the design and construction process used in the creation of the garments that we have developed for the exhibition, which you can see sitting here beside us. One thing that I would like to point out before we get started is that up until very recently, there has been very little acknowledgement or research of fashion systems existing outside of the European fashion model. So while we will obviously be discussing European fashion history in detail today and celebrating the history of European painting, I would also like to remind you that dress practice is universal to human culture. All cultures dress and adorn the body. All cultures have their own perspectives and histories of dress that are equally as fascinating and important as the history we are about to discuss today. So if you enjoy listening to us today, hopefully this might inspire you to do some of your own research into the history of non-Western dress. As I've just said, most fashion theorists mark the start of the contemporary fashion system as we know it at around the mid-14th century. Some significant contextual changes happened at this time and were reflected in the way that people dressed. Previous to this period, clothing was made in loose and simple T-shapes, and there was very little differentiation between masculine and feminine dress. As we can see here in the Crucifixion by Fra Angelico, there is an overall uniformity in garment style and cut, which was based on a simple, loose-fitting T-shape, a form that economically used the precious woven cloth without little need to cut the fabric. But from the mid-14th century on, we see a move away from pure functional and economic use of cloth, and instead see an increasing emphasis on clothing that is cut to contour the body or voluminously obscure it. In 1344, John of Reading bitterly complained of his fashionable contemporaries. Sometimes their clothes are long and wide, at others they are short, tight, dagged, and cut about and boned all round. What a nag. This new style of dress was a dramatic change from the simple dress forms of previous centuries. And it is with this divergence that we can see the bones of the contemporary Western fashion system emerge. And this system can be typified by some of these elements that we can see right here. So a lack of consistent fashionable form or uniformity of dress, and a consistent movement towards changing styles. This lack of uniformity also made space for individuals to differentiate themselves through dress, linking fashion to identity. There's also the implied economic waste through both the cutting of cloth to create tight-fitting, contoured garments, and the excessive use of cloth in elements such as extravagant sleeves, gowns, and accessories. The manipulation and obscuring of the natural body to form a fashionable silhouette was another element, as people began to look sometimes quite alien. And the heightened sense of visual differentiation between the genders into distinct masculine and feminine attire. We can see many of these elements typified here in Paradise by Italian painter Giovanni di Paolo in 1445. While this painting was made a century after John of Reading's comments on the new fashions, we can still see many of the elements he was critiquing. Remember, fashion at this time changed very slowly compared to today. Here we can see a significant variety in dress style, with experiments with contour and volume to display a range of silhouette. The genders can be identified more clearly through their style of dress, and there is an elaborate use of cloth as purely decorative, with long dragging scallop sleeves and cutwork trimming. The changes in how people dress was spurred by significant social and economic changes, much of which rode on the sheep's back. Throughout the Middle Ages, wool was the primary fabric used in clothing production, and England, having the largest production of wool fibre, strategically started to localise and industrialise fabric production by enticing skilled Flemish weavers to emigrate. There was also a lot of innovation in the mechanical technology used to create fabric, such as the invention of the spinning wheel, fulling mills, and the advancement of the horizontal loom. This movement of people to cities and the innovation of industrial technology can be seen as the first signs of industrial revolution. With the swelling of cities and the quicker and cheaper industrialized processes of production, we see a growing middle class. Tradespeople and merchants, newly wealthy through the means of capitalist enterprise, blur the clear lines of feudal society's social hierarchy, where wealth and power are directly connected to the king. The middle class were the spark to set the fashion system in motion. As the middle class adopted the styles of the aristocracy, the aristocrats began to frequently change their styles in an endless race to distinguish themselves from those below. This is also where we start to see sumptuary laws come into play, drawing a framework between social standing and wealth. Now, fashion, of course, up until about the 19th century, was the primary domain of men. I know, but he's fabulous, as it was an occupation related to wealth, power, and status. During the Renaissance, we see radical stylistic and technical development in the craft of tailoring. Fashionable masculine attire in the 16th century formalized into a structured silhouette that broadened the chest and shoulders, ballooned the thighs and hips, while displaying slim and athletic legs. This silhouette was achieved through a combination of padding and clever cutting, as the clever cutting of Renaissance tailors, and can be seen as a foundational precursor to the contemporary suit. The surface of garments worn by the nobility and the wealthy became very detailed, with silk satins, velvets, and brocades, as well as lavish embroidery and the incorporation of jeweled ornaments. In the painting of Boy with Grey Hound by Paulo Varanosi, I don't think I said his name correctly, but Bertin, thank you. We can see both the tailored silhouette and the fashionable textiles popular amongst the stylish male elite. Masculine attire consisted of the doublet, a close-fitting button jacket, which on this suave young man is made from a lustrous striped fabric that helps to emphasize the horizontal breadth of his silhouette and the curved paunch of his belly. This shape was called the piz cod, a shape that mimicked the design of Spanish armor and was formed artificially by stuffing the doublet with a mixture of cotton rag, horsehair, and flock. The sleeves of the doublet were cut to curve at the elbow and were often slashed to allow for movement. This jaunty, hand-on-hip pose was very popular in male portraiture in the period and displayed the scope of movement in this garment. Like the doublet, breeches were also very popular to be stuffed and padded in the Spanish style. Excuse me, I think I need a sip of water. Yeah. Stuffed and padded in the Spanish style. And the codpiece, originally a simple and functional element of the garment, evolved into an artfully padded and ornamented pouch that emphasized the male genitals as a declaration of virility. Stockings had been innovated in the mid-16th century as knitting replaced bias-cut fabric, allowing for a closer fitting tight and a renewal in the erotic appeal of the male leg at the time. Women's dresses also began to formalize at this time. A primary feminine garment was the kirtle. This was originally a full-length gown, but by the mid-16th century, it had morphed into a separate bodice and matching skirt, with the skirt retaining the name. This is also the time when we started to see women wearing corsetry. The term bodice comes from this period and directly means two bodies, as these garments were usually made from a left and a right-hand side, which would lace together at front and back. Similar to the doublet that added bulk and form to the masculine body through padding, the corset morphed the feminine silhouette with the use of stiff structural elements that constricted and supported the body. These came in the form of whalebone, dried reed, quilted fabric, stiffened buckram, pasteboard, and wooden busks. From this period until the 20th century, with a few small exceptions, women's and men's fashion was based on these foundational elements: the bodice, corset, and skirt for women, and the jacket and bifurcated lower garments for men. This is not to say that they did not evolve and change from this moment. In fact, stylistic changes in fashion continued to increase in pace. By the time of this painting, Allegory of the Catholic Faith, by Johannes Vermeer in the 1670s, the fashionable look was markedly different from the previous century. The fashionable silhouette of the 1570s consisted of a stiffly structured, long and narrow bodice, necks and décolletage hidden beneath the starched linen ruffs, and skirts held erect and drum-shaped by a circular hoop called the farthingale. A century later, we see a significant softening of the feminine form as the farthingale is no longer worn and the rigidity and length of the corsets has been greatly reduced. This period saw the bodice develop a wide, shallow neckline and voluminous sleeves that emphasized a softly sloping neck and shoulder, the height of feminine beauty. Dress consisted of a petticoat or underskirt and overgown, which was open at the front and gathered to reveal the skirt beneath. By the 17th century, France was the undisputed leader of fashion in Europe, and fashionable dress began to see increasingly rapid changes driven by history's first fashion journals, boutiques, and the flamboyant French aristocracy. The fashion industry was also significantly bolstered by the French King Louis XIV and his finance minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who influenced the French nobility to spend lavishly on fashion and textiles. This strategy was twofold, as it aimed to boost the economic success of the French textile industry, at the same time as exert a level of power and influence over his court through financial expectancy. The grand habit, the regulated dress required to attend court, was outrageously expensive and could cost more than a modest chateau. The grand habit squeezed women into inverse cone shapes, while men donned long overjackets, waistcoats, and pantaloons or breeches. This can be seen as the earliest variation of the three-piece suit, which has become a stalwart of Western male dress. The garments of both sexes were elaborately embellished with embroidery, lace, and jewels for court occasions, and were accessorized with elaborate headwear, wigs, and makeup. In this painting, Paying the Hostess, by Peter de Hooch in 1670, we get some insight into dress between different classes. The gentleman wears a fashionable French look, including a long overjacket with gilt buttons and embroidery, clean white stockings, a wig, and a feathered hat. His clothing communicates his relative wealth and lifestyle of ease. Conversing with him, the inn's hostess is well but modestly and practically dressed. In a nod to fashion, she wears a vibrant red skirt and what appears to be a velvet fur-trimmed short overdress. However, her garments give way to the practicalities of her role as an innkeeper, as she also wears a modest linen cap, clogs, dark apron, and her sleeves are safely rolled up and out of the way of any dirt. By the 18th century, the bold Baroque styles of Louis XIV's court had softened into the pastel-hued Rococo elegance of his great-grandson, Louis XV. Interestingly, fashion at this time was not set by the Queen, but instead by the King's flamboyant mistress, Madame de Pompadour. Francois Butcher was the chosen painter of Madame de Pompadour, and he painted her in many of her decadent fashionable gowns. This painting by Butcher, which so clearly displays the aesthetic palette of the Rococo period, was commissioned to hang in de Pompadour's Chateau de Bellevue. The painting of the two sisters, while it is a painting of young children, is still quite clearly illustrative of how adults dressed during this period. It was typical for children to be dressed in miniature versions of adult attire. Fashion at this time was pushed to new levels of extravagance by the infamous new French queen, Marie Antoinette, and saw women dressed in wide-hipped panniers and towering hairdos, which were elaborately dressed with ornaments. Significantly, female fashion merchants rise to prominence at this time. Tailoring, haberdashery, and textile trade had up until this point been dominated by men. Rose Bertin is perhaps the most famously lauded of these emerging female couturiers through her close association with Marie Antoinette. Some have even claimed that she can be considered the first ever fashion designer. In this painting of the Comtesse de la of the Comtesse, I'm going to say it very incorrectly. I am not very good at French, I'm sorry. We can see the start of an aesthetic shift towards a more pastoral style and a more classic style of dress. Through her simple white muslin gown and more relaxed coiffure. Titillatingly, an early adopter of this pastoral aesthetic was Marie Antoinette, who, inspired by the philosophies of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, playfully sat for portraits dressed as a shepherdess in a simple white chemise. Because of this, the already unpopular queen received a lot of criticism. As the chemise was worn as an undergarment, many viewed the portrait as lewd, the equivalent of painting the queen in her knickers. After the French Revolution and the fall of the French monarchy, the extravagant court dress of the aristocracy was discarded in lieu of a new democratic mode of dressing. This politically geared style shift took notes from the drapery of Greek art and sculpture, the ancestral home of democratic ideologies. The revival of this ancient aesthetic was labelled Neoclassicism. And neoclassic dress has become mostly associated with the chemise dress. This style of dress was made from several layers of lightweight cottons and muslins and was cut high at the waist, sitting directly under the bust. A column-style skirt that sat much closer to the figure than previous fashion silhouettes, and a low-cut neckline. This cut of dress is now commonly referred to as an empire-style dress, a term that we can trace back to its popularity during the rise of the French Empire. The fine cotton muslin used in this style could only be achieved in India, who had a roaring trade for cotton at this time. And the trade between the continents also popularized the wearing of Indian cashmere shawls as a fashionable accessory. The Victorian era, which stretched for the majority of the 19th century, once again saw feminine silhouettes exaggerated to remarkable proportions, with masculine fashion becoming more austere and uniform in the face of modernity. The role of fashion as conspicuous consumption fell almost solely to women's dress. As outlined by American economist Thorstein Veblen in his Theory of the Leisure Class, the corset and crinolines of the Victorian woman cemented her role as a decorative barometer of her husband or father's wealth. Physically encumbered and restricted by the fashionable clothes she wears, this new way of displaying your wealth points out the leisurely lifestyle of the wealthy, where they do not have to work and hence can extravagantly indulge in fashions that hinder their very movement. The lightweight crinoline, a skirt made from a hooped wire that was used in lieu of heavy layers of petticoats, allowed the breadth of skirt hems to grow astronomically. By the 1870s, when this portrait of a young woman by the seashore was painted, the full crinoline had gone out of vogue and skirts had been swept back to form the bustle. The bustle distorted the feminine shape to give it the appearance of a column-like silhouette while front-facing, and abnormally large buttocks in profile. Perhaps this young woman in the painting is feeling the restrictive form of her clothes and the weight of her role as a woman in society as she sits quietly and beautifully rather than playing in the ocean that is before her. And that brings me to the tail end of my discussion of some of our paintings and the history of fashion from the exhibition. But we also wanted to take you through a quick jaunt through some of the 20th century designers who, like us, hold a very deep fascination with the past and used it as inspiration in their designs. Firstly, there's Madeleine Vienney, who is credited as the inventor of the bias-cut dress and was part of the anti-corset fashion generation that emerged around the 1880s. Instead of drawing designs, Vienney often draped directly on the body, using drape and cut that was inspired by the Greek peplos, a simple rectangle of cloth attached at the shoulders and belted at the waist. Vienney was known to often visit the Louvre, to study the classical Greek urns there, and we can see this interest communicated in her designs. There were two basic forms of dress form, which Greek styles were derived: the shinton, which was in a dress shape, and the chemise, which is a cloak. The peplos is a variation of the shinton. All of these garments were based on a rectangular shape and used the Greek law of thirds called the golden selection or the golden ratio, which is often used in classical art composition. This law of thirds is said to have influenced Vienney, lowering the waistline of her designs during the 1920s. And just some words of Vienney's to inspire us. I like to look at old costumes and fashion of times gone by because of what they say about their times. They tell us so much about their era and the people in it. My inspiration comes from Greek vases, from the beautifully clothed women depicted in them, or even the noble lines of the vase itself. Another designer fascinated by the past was Christian Dior. His namesake fashion label was founded in 1946 and has been notably influenced by Impressionist painters such as Degas, Manet, Renoir, and Cézanne. Dior often created replica costumes directly from artworks for socialite clientele, as well as drawing inspiration from artworks for fabrication, texture, pattern, and cut. Dior's childhood friend, writer André Fragonard, once compared Dior's dress fitting to an Impressionist artwork, saying, "This scene reflected in the large mirror resembles a Degas pastel, or rather a series of pastels, for the dress changes color, turns blue, darkens, then lightens again." Dior's post-war new look, which is probably his most famous design, which he released in 1947, which saw tiny waists and bell-shaped skirts come into vogue, was in fact a revival of past decadence, referring back to the voluminous silhouettes of the early Victorian era, which in turn in itself was a revival of the wide-hipped panniers of the 18th century. As a brand, Dior has also been headed by notable designers who, like Christian Dior himself, have had a distinct fascination with the past as a source of inspiration, and these include Yves Saint Laurent and John Galliano. Our next designer is Vivian Westwood, who I have to say is probably one of my all-time favorite designers, for obvious reasons. Synonymous with the punk movement of the 1970s, Vivian Westwood became famous for her punk anti-establishment slogan tees and deconstructed fashion that was sold in her famous fashion store Sex, where she ran with her partner Malcolm McLaren. By the 1980s, after parting ways with McLaren, Westwood became a symbol of avant-garde fashion, with her collections often using elements from history. Starting with her 1981 Pirates collection, which features historically cut garments in loud contemporary prints. Likewise, her 1986 mini crinoline collection explored a mini version of the crinoline. Westwood began to demonstrate an increasing interest in revisiting and reconceptualizing historic 17th and 18th century styles. Though Westwood had explored punk versions of underwear as outerwear in her early years, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, Westwood began designing 18th century influenced corsets using historic artwork prints and classic 18th century corset shapes. The corset has become one of her most recognizable signature pieces. Westwood is fascinated by paintings and is known to frequent museum collections to study them in detail. And we can often draw direct parallels between her designs and the work of 17th and 18th century painters, such as this 1996 gown and the corresponding portrait by Butcher of his patron de Pompadour. Another inspiring quote for us by Westwood. To look at a painting is to enter a world. It's an absolute delight. The only place to find ideas is by looking at what people did in the past. It's the way you can be original. You can't be original by just wanting to do something. Nothing comes from a vacuum. It is impossible to be creative unless you have a link to the past and tradition. You cannot merely have a desire to create something and attempt to do so without learning from the techniques of the past. So as Shannon was saying earlier, as part of the exhibition, we were lucky enough to be invited to remake some of the historic costumes of 3 key paintings. These paintings were Vermeer's Allegory of the Catholic Faith, Jean-Baptiste Grisou's Broken Eggs, and Marie Denise Viller's Mary Josephine Charlotte Duval d'Angers. These garments, as you may know, have been used as the subject matter for daily life drawing sessions in this beautiful activation space between the 2 galleries. When approaching the recreation of clothes from paintings, we must first understand how we are looking at and understanding the clothes that are being depicted. Clothes in works of art are inherently connected to clothes in real life. That is to say, clothes in our contemporary lives. So when we are looking at clothes in paintings, like the ones in this exhibition, even those paintings from the distant past of 500 years ago, we see and understand them through the lens of our own contemporary experiences, cultures, and understandings of clothes. This is actually easier for us than you might think, and happens at a subconscious level when we're looking at these works of art. Clothes are an essential part of our daily lives, and there is very little of our lived experience that we spend without clothes. The clothes that we wear are a key element to how we form and express our identity. In our societies, it has been used through history to define our gender, class, occupations, wealth, sexuality, and geographic origins, amongst many other things. And it continues to play a very important part of how we express ourselves to other people and how we understand the people around us. So our experience of clothes, something that is both unique to us as individuals and shared by us as a society, form the lens through which we understand the clothes we view in art. For our purposes, the basic reading of an image can be broken into 3 forms of comprehension: aesthetic, material, and embodied. The aesthetic is our senses. What is it that we see visually? And what do we recognize through our other forms of sense, like touch, taste, scent, and sound? The aesthetic is our ability to look and experience and translate into knowledge. The material is our understanding of the lived textural life of clothes and materials. It's the inherent knowledge that forms our visual representation of the world in real life, be it spiky or stiff to the touch, shiny and slippery, soft and fuzzy. And finally, the embodied. So the embodied represents our personal experience of having worn clothes and the subconscious knowledge our bodies have of what it feels like to physically wear clothing. On top of this, we as individuals experience very specific and very different emotional, social, and cultural aspects towards clothing depending on our lived experiences of our histories of wearing clothing. From this first reading of the paintings, we move on to research. As a starting point, we researched various textbooks and online resources from information on the clothing of the periods of each of these paintings. Some of the amazing museum resources we looked into included the collection of the Kyoto Costume Museum, the Met Costume Institute collection, and the Victoria and Albert Museum collection. For a more in-depth making perspective, we looked primarily at the forebears of historic garment research. Mainly Jeanette Arnold and Nora Waugh, but I'd also like to give Betty Kirk a notable mention, as she's also a brilliant costume historian in this area. The detailed research of historic costumes formed the basis of many of our go-to resources as costume makers working in the industry. Jeanette Arnold is of particular note. She was a British clothing historian, costume designer, teacher, conservator, and author of some amazing historical costume resources. We highly recommend that you check her out, the work that she's done, the many books that she's published, and her foundation, the School of Historic Dress. Our original pattern for Allegory of the Catholic Faith was drafted from a Jeanette Arnold's book, Patterns of Fashion 5. From the first pattern drafting stage, one of the biggest hurdles of clothing recreation is how to adapt original historical patterns to modern bodies, which are taller and larger with different muscle definition. As makers, the toile, or the practice garment that is commonly made from calico, is a huge help for us in understanding the pattern, the fabric, and the construction process needed to create the final costume. Allegory, for example, took 2 toiles and 3 different patterns before we were happy with the shape enough to try it on a model. Another huge hurdle for historic recreation is fabrication. Researching and finding the right textiles and materials to create the right shape, drape, weight, and luster is one of the most important elements in recreating historical costume. However, it can be time-consuming and quite challenging to do it as specific to. It can be quite challenging to do, as specific textiles can be difficult to find, supply is often limited and extremely expensive. The global situation at the moment honestly didn't help with this. But working inside the Brisbane costume industry, we are both very lucky to have access to some great industry suppliers locally and internationally that we were able to source from. Silhouette is of huge importance to historical accuracy in costumes. As a maker, our first step always starts with the undergarments. Often, corsets and crinolines, bustles, or hip pads form the recognizable shapes of the historical garments. When you undertake reconstructing a costume from a painting, it's impossible to make a truly authentic item. Access to historically accurate material items such as thread and fiber, as well as the machinery and processing systems, and even the physicality of the maker's skills, is wildly different now to what it was in different points of history. Instead, what is created is an interpretation of an authentic item. Textile conservatist Kate Gill defines this choice-making process as informed compromise. For us, this informed compromise was an amalgamation of synthesizing visual and textual historic information with the physical requirements needed for the maintenance and wearing of these garments. On the one hand, the garments needed to adhere to the silhouette, materials, and construction of the historical counterpart, and on the other, the practicalities of the costume were crucial, as the models would have to dress themselves, move and pose in them for hours, and the garments would have to be regularly cleaned. Whilst we have sourced some amazing fabrics and materials that are very similar to what would have been historically used, there are quite a few elements within these costumes that are decidedly not historically accurate. We've used very modern materials such as nylon boning, interfacing, polynylon netting, and the list goes on. We also used modern machinery to sew these costumes. Where possible, we have incorporated historic techniques such as cartridge pleating into the making process. And I'm not going to lie, there is a lot of hand sewing in these costumes as well, because sometimes you can't help but to just do it by hand. Like their historic counterparts, for ease of washing, all three costumes had a period-appropriate undershift in linen or cotton, which could be easily washed and would protect the outer garments from bodily sweat. From this base layer, Broken Eggs, which is the garment right at the end there, was quite easy to self-dress. The blue shot linen skirt had just a simple back opening. The thick natural linen corset did up over the underlayers and easily fastened at the front. The silk stripe neck scarf was then draped around the neck and tucked into the white linen apron. She's also wearing a little blue cotton crocheted skull cap and was originally a doily that we hand dyed and threaded with rimmed to become a little hat. Along with this, she's wearing thigh-high socks that were sourced from a historical replica shop called Darcy's in the UK. And the shoes are also historical replicas from an American brand called the American Duchess in the US, which we then hand-painted in order to accurately match the shoes in the painting. For the second dress that's in the middle of our three mannequins here, Marie Josephine Charlotte Duval de Ongs. In order to create the right silhouette, we made a separate corset that went over the top of the undershift, which did up at the center back. Traditionally, women wearing these costumes would have had help getting dressed. Our corset was laced in a way where our model was able to dress by herself. She's also very flexible. A soft cotton muslin overdress with a pink silk waist tie was added over this and done up from the back as well. And we did very much compromise here, and that dress has a zip in it. This dress also has the necktie permanently attached so that it would continually reflect the visual reference of the painting. She's also wearing thigh-high socks from Darcy's in the UK, and the shoes are silk ballet slippers that have been painted to reflect the correct colours of the painting. And the hairpin that she uses was hand-carved and sourced in Australia. The Allegory of the Catholic Faith costume needed the corset to be built into the dress itself, as the back closure was much higher and harder for the model to do up alone. The blue silk cotton outer skirt is sewn to the bodice with cartridge pleats, with the silk cotton cream underskirt attached to the bodice underneath, so it was easier for the model to put it on. This dress had some small hip pads added, and these are attached permanently inside the dress as well, so that the underskirt could create the correct silhouette as that in the painting. The blue sandals were made in Europe specially for this project, and the pearl necklace was sourced locally. So with that, our little tour through our costumes, I'm going to conclude our talk. Thank you for listening. I hope we've given you some insight into the history of fashion and our costume making process. Thank you.